Hello everyone, welcome to Careerflite. Today I'm going to conduct a session on world politics and whereby we talk about world history. This is a continuation of the series of the history, and today we would start with world history where we will learn about the historical point of view from the world, whereby we see that what were the events that were happening in the world history. So starting the first point in world history would be the emergence of feudalism. Now, when we see world history, basically in the medieval period, we see the emergence of feudal system. Now, what is feudal system exactly? Now, feudal system, it basically started in Europe, and it was a system by which a conditional ownership of land was being conferred to certain people. Now, this system arose due to the lack of single authority. Single authority, in the sense, the lack of central political authority, for which the nobilities were being actually hired for this conditional ownership of the land. Now, during this process, many things happened, like various big as well as the smaller kingdoms in Europe emerged. Now, due to which, what happened, local landlords became more powerful than the king. So we can say that land was the basis of power rather than money, because the king possessed the money. However, the nobles were the one who were in possession of the land. So we can say that uh, land was more important than money in this period of time, which made these nobles very, very powerful with time. So the next point becomes, when we see the feudalism as a system, emerging in this world history, we see that village-based economy comes into existence, and the peasants used to work for this feudal lords. Now, in this way, what happened was that the feudal lords started exploiting the peasants too. So, therefore, we see that serfdom becomes an important feature of feudalism. Now, in feudalism, now when this feudalism came into emergence, what do we observe is a hierarchical pattern which is being followed, whereby the king remains at the top. The king remains at the top, and thereby there were different layers which were occupied by different feudal lords, and at last also the peasants. So therefore this kind of hierarchy was actually dominant in that period of time. However, we should notice one thing, that the entire land was actually occupied by the king. But however, their possessions were given to the nobles under certain conditions, which made the politics of this period, you know, a different from a in a different way it was being projected, whereby we see that later on the king becomes weaker than the nobles, who was only the conditional owners of land. Now, what was the consequence of this system? That becomes very much important in those time. Now, as a result of this feudalism, we observe that the welfare prospects of the people, that means the king was to take care of the welfare of the people, now which became very, very stagnant. Now, the welfare of the people was not actually taken care of. And as a result of this feudalism, we also see that, later in the later period, we see economic stagnation that was going on in this places of the world. Now, as there was no economic freedom, no social freedom, the peasants actually could not move from one place to another, and they were tied to the particular land for which they were working, and thereby they were under certain feudatories. Now, after this feudal stage, what do we observe? That the society evolves, whereby we see different organizations, different institutions coming into existence with a powerful hold over the society. Now similarly, like after feudalism, what came up was the church rule, whereby the pope became very important figure of the society. Now a pope is one who actually takes care of the religious perspective in the church. Now, or we can see that that is similar to a priest. Now this pope used to be very important figure in the society. So the church then became important institutions in order to dominate the society, whereby we see that the church even went on to provide education to people, whereby people were actually acquiring education from the church. But however, this church education would only lead to a very limited career scope for the people, where the people would only become priest later on. So what happened later on was that with time, this pope, or the nuns, the bishops, etc., who were all related to the organization called as church, also became very corrupt in the later years. And that was the time when we see that many scientific thinkers who would come up with various modern ideas about the society, about the world, also became the victim of the church. Now these rational thinkers had actually posed a challenge against the church, whereby they were driven by more rational thinking, more scientific thinking, which the church did not actually you know entertain. And therefore these rational thinkers were being attacked by the church. Now, however, the time with time, the situations also changed in this era. Now after this church, the evolution of the church, we see that Europe in around 7th century AD, we see that it comes in contact with Arab nations. Now, when it comes in contact with the Arab nations, we see that they were more exposed to trade, commerce, etc., where we see that merchant class comes up in this society, whereby we should understand that when merchant classes emerged in the society, that means trade and commerce was actually flourishing in this society. And as a result, what came up was the concept of town, trade, crafts, etc. These things saw rapid emergence in this era. And after that, what we see that cities also came into existence, mostly in the they were in the form of port cities, as well as also the cities we could see in the juncture of the important highways whereby people passed. And therefore we see flourishing trade coming up in the society. And with this flourishing trade, we also see the emergence of the merchant class. Now in this period, what happened was that these merchants, they started organizing themselves in a organization whereby they could produce a specific goods, okay, which was called as a guild. That means a guild could be understood as an organization of the merchants, whereby they could actually monopolize over the production of certain commodities. Now with this guilds, things evolved more and more. Now what was seen was that money becomes more important than land in the society, because people were actually doing trade and thereby increasing their assets, that is their property, and therefore which became very important in the world. So therefore in feudal system, in when feudalism was going on in the society, what we found is that land became important rather than money, whereby we see the nobilities were becoming very powerful. But now what we see with this merchant class coming up and also flourishing trade and commerce, we see that money again becomes very important rather than the holding of lands. Now, what happened due to this, influence of merchant class? Let us see. Now, as these merchant classes, were going for more and more trade, obviously towns came up, and as a result of that, one very important thing happened in history was the social mobility of the peasants, whereby the peasants from the villages were actually moving to these towns in search of work, in search of money, in search of employment. So we see a huge number of people actually moves from one region to another, whereby we see not only the flourishing trade but also a cultural exchange, also a sense of freedom in the people, which was really absent in feudalism period. So now money become the most important source of power. Then what we see with this evolution of money, with this evolution of merchant class, we see that like cash based economic system took place. Okay, now this we can call something which is driven by profit motives, more by profit motives, whereby you know the economy turned into something called as capitalist economy, where we see that people were more driven towards profit motives, and thereby they used to produce more more goods, and also this led to a surplus which they acquire, and thereby from the money which they would acquire from that, they would rather they would further invest it rather than storing it. And while this investment took place, more and more assets, more and more power was being captured by this merchant class. So we see a capitalist trend was actually looming high in the society. Now, what happened due to this was that the towns became the center of power, or the center of production, rather than the villages. So in feudalism, what did we see? That villages were very, very important, location where the production used to take place, and also the dominant nature of the feuds were taking place. But at this stage of evolution, what do we see? With the coming of mercantilist class, with the coming of capitalism, we see that the power source actually shifts from the village towards the towns or the cities. Now, so in this way, this capitalism actually evolved in these societies, whereby we see that power actually shifted from being owner of a land to you know owner of money. Now, see, the next period comes when we see the period of Renaissance, which also is a very important factor of history, where we see a lot of new things coming up in world history, and which had a great influence over not only Europe but also the entire world. Now, what exactly is Renaissance? What exactly is Renaissance? When we see the concept of Renaissance, it simply means, emerging new ideas, whereby you actually challenge the ancient ideas, ancient thoughts, only those were based on irrationality, unscientific, and also sometimes inhuman. So when we see the emergence of Renaissance, we see that modern thinkers comes up, and they started reviewing the literature, the education of the ancient times. And after this review, what these thinkers found was that most of the ideas and the concepts were based on some kind of irrationality, superstitious belief, more oriented towards religious belief, and many more things which were not really scientific in nature. So therefore these thinkers came up with a new idea, whereby many new concepts actually evolved in this period of time, where we see that the most important thing, the focus of these thinkers was, rationality, scientific temper, and above all humanism. Because before, we used to see in ancient as well as, in the periods which were again, before Renaissance, we observed that, many practices in the society were such that it went to certain inhuman practices. So, but whenever this Renaissance came into picture, the thinkers were more concerned with the human nature of human being, whereby things or the rules of the society was more based on humanism, more based on scientific temper, more based on rationality, rather than something which was irrational, superstitious, etc. So Renaissance also becomes one of the most important feature of world history, whereby we see a transition in world history, we see a transition in the ideas of thinkings, of people, and also we see a change in the societal system, from the ancient to the Renaissance period. Now, so this we can say it was a scientific revolution that came up in the world history. Similarly, Reformation was also a period which came after Renaissance, whereby we see that, different kind of like revolutions came up in the society in order to challenge the ancient trends which were going on in the society. Now, in this time, what we observe, the most important thing was the Protestant Reformation. This was the period when we see, you know Protestant church was set up in Germany. That means a different wing of what we have seen in the earlier period, the church, whereby we see a division in the church, the Protestant as well as, the Catholic. These two sections comes up in during this period with their own ideology of life. So what this Protestant actually believe was that, r- uh, they believed that, reason was more important than religion in order to operate in the society. That means in order to lead a life in the society, what was more important was reason, that is scientific temper, rather than the religious rules or the religious norms which people follow blindly. So therefore we see that, the Bible, they went on, translating the Bible into different local languages, whereby what was happening, that, local people who were not able to read this Bible and thereby interpret it with their own reason, with their own logic, was absent. But when this Protestant reforms came up, we see that huge number of conversion of these Bibles, translation of these Bibles was taking place in local language, whereby more and more people used to, you know read the actual text of Bibles and thereby get the real interpretation of the Bible, which was actually happening because, before what used to happen, that sometimes misinterpretation of these holy books was also taking place in the society, whereby it was leading to more corruption in the society, more evils in the society. So therefore now we see that, people were actually reading the Bible, themselves in their own language, and thereby was able to, get the hold of what exactly the Bible talks about, what exactly the religion talks about. So the next era, what we see, the Catholics, they were also, called as soldiers of Jesus. Uh, Now, however, after this Catholic section also came up, there was, we see a continuous struggle between these two sections of the church. Now, what we see that, due to this, there was also in, Britain became the powerhouse during this era. What we see that Britain was playing a very important role. Now during this era, what we see is that, there was a strife between the monarchical force as well as the parliamentary force in Britain, that is in England. So there was a continuous fight, between the monarchy and the parliamentarians who wanted their rule in the country. Then, what happened after that, we again see that the beginning of the new era happened, in which what we observe is that, sea voyages were taking place widely, whereby we see that various travelers were traveling around the world via sea route, whereby they were actually establishing different colonies, whereby they were finding new lands, whereby they could actually go and colonize those nations. And a huge number of colonies come up in the scene, where the powerful countries like Britain used to actually take over these colonies and dominate them in all spheres, say administratively, politically, culturally, and whatnot. So we see that the emergence of colonialism takes place with this starting of sea voyages in the world. Now, what was the real reason of this colonial trends? We need to understand that. Now, we should know that Europeans basically, in the initial years, they colonized the other nations not with the intention of political or administrative, point of view. They only did so for expanding the trade relations with the other countries of the world, whereby we see that they were actually trying to get hold of many markets in the world, okay, whereby they can sell their products which they used to produce in their own country. So then what we see that 7 years war breaks out. Now what was this 7 years war? Now when we see this colonization was taking place by Britain basically, and France was also another power in Europe which was also very powerful, and they also wanted to capture more and more colonies. So therefore there was a strife between this Britain and France in Europe. Now these two powers clashed, and the first war became the War of 7 Years' War. That means it was a very long year, and that therefore it was named as the 7 Years Global War. Now, why it is known as global? Because it was not only fought in Europe, but it was been fought in the entire world. Different regions were actually used for fighting the wars, but however, this war was fought between only Britain and France, like North America, Caribbean countries, India, Africa, and also other parts of Europe, where these two powers were actually fighting this war. Now what was the reason of this war? This becomes very important. Now the reason is nothing but to dominate over these colonies. That means to establish the hegemony. Now hegemony means the sole leadership. So, France as well as Britain wanted to be a hegemon when colonization was concerned. That means they wanted to capture more and more colonies, and therefore they fought together. But what happened was that America became one of the most important colonies of Britain. Now, this France was trying to resist Britain to take over America as their colony, and therefore this war became more intense day by day. Then, however, we see that it came to an end by a Treaty of Paris. But in this Treaty of Paris, it was seen that Britain finally takes over the charge of America and also other colonies, whereby France actually surrenders. But it laid the foundation of American as well as French Revolution in history. Now, what was American Revolution all about? It was a revolution which was basically, done by the people of American continent against the British rule, who was the colonizers of the Americans. Now there were various reasons which actually took place in America when British was colonizing America, and that has actually led the people of America to revolt against the colonial power. Now, let us see some of the reasons of American War of Independence. So, number one becomes mercantile capitalism. Now, what is mercantilized capitalism? What is this concept all about? Now, see, mercantile capitalism was actually a British policy by which Britishers England used to, you know, rule their country as well as their colonies. Okay, and therefore America was a colony of Britain, and so America's, right to trade was restricted by Britain. That means Britain used to regulate and control the trade of America. Now, which actually made the Americans very dissatisfied because that was somehow, restricting their freedom. So, what happened was that uh, Americans were, prevented from uh, setting up new industries of American origin in their land itself. So, it becomes a very huge reason of discontentment among the Americans against the British. And therefore, this becomes an important reason whereby we see that Americans were actually revolting against the British later on. Now, the next we see that there were many reasons like role of enlightenment thinkers. Now, as I already told, that renaissance was an important factor that took place in world history. Similarly, a group of enlightened thinkers, they came up in America now, and also in the entire world. Now, the ideas that was being provided by these thinkers were more rational, more scientific, whereby they were more emphasizing on human rights. So therefore, when Americans found that their rights were being actually deprived by the colonizers, then they were really inspired to revolt against the Britishers. So the role of enlightenment thinkers become important. Enlightenment thinkers. Now, number three is recovery of the 7 year war expenditure. 7 year war expenditure. Now, what was this? Now, see, as the 7 years war took place, the Americans were actually fighting in support of the Britishers because as they were the colony, they need to go by the words of the colonizers. Now, see what happened. There was huge amount of money that was involved in this war while England was fighting with France. Now, as Britishers lost, a huge amount of money in this war, now they started, recovering that amount. But what was the strategy to recover? Now, these Britishers, what they did, they imposed taxes on the American people in order to recovery, you know, the amount that was being spent on this war. Now, this became a very important reason of discontentment of the American people. Moreover, another reason was that no representation in no representation in British Parliament. No representation in British Parliament. Now, what was it? Now, see, so what these Americans thought was that when these Americans were, imposed certain taxes which were very illogical in nature, they said that we won't pay any tax unless and until we get representation in the English Parliament, whereby they could actually voice, their demands in the Parliament and thereby, get their demands fulfilled. However, they went for this. That means no representation in British Parliament. That means no taxation without representation was the slogan. That means they won't pay tax until and unless they're given a chance to represent in the British Parliament and thereby, uh, forwarding their demands of the American people. Now, after all these reasons came out, actually a war broke out between Britain and America. Now, in this war, what happened? Finally, this France, Spain, and also Dutch Republic helped the Americans to fight the war against the Britishers. Now, later on, what happened? In 1783, we see that British commander Cornwallis surrenders before the army led by George Washington, and thereby we see the end of American War of Independence. And the Second Treaty of Paris was signed between them. Now, this is how American War of Independence took place, and we see that uh, Britain actually leaves America as a colony, and therefore they gain independence. So similarly, the French Revolution also takes place in the same lines, in the similar lines. Now, during this French Revolution, we see that French society was uh, divided into three distinct parts, whereby the population of the French societies were divided into clearly three classes, whereby number one was the clergy. Now, French society, three divisions. Number one was the clergy. Number two were the nobles. And number three were the common people, which was 80% of the population. Now, when we see French Revolution, what do we see? That the society was to clearly divided into these three classes. Now, clergy were, the largest landowners. This clergy was the landowners, whereas the nobles were, the people who were occupying high of the people were of the society were included, like the middle class people, the artisans, the city workers, the peasants, etc. Now they constituted 80% of the population. Now, what actually led to this French Revolution uh, comes from this division of the society, basically. Now we see that that this first two classes were actually exploiting the third group of the society, because they occupied certain you know uh, great positions in the government, as well as when it comes to land ownership. Now they were powerful than these people, but however, what these people had was a majority of population, which again the manpower becomes important in this area, which these people did not have. Now, due to the intense exploitation of the third group by these other two groups, actually led to French Revolution, whereby people of France, that means the common people of France, were demanding a rule whereby people's representation was, ensured, whereby the welfare of the people was ensured, rather than the elites or the monarchy that was taking place in France, who were exploiting the common people of France. So later on, what we see that many phases of this French Revolution was taking place in history, and at last we see that French Republic comes into existence, and where Napoleon was a figure who played a very important role, and also Jacobins were another group which also played a very important role in French Revolution. So therefore, due to all this effort made by these people, where Renaissance or the Enlightenment thinkers have also inspired them. And then we see finally a French Republic comes into being, whereby rights of the people, equality, fraternity, this all principles, liberty, this all principles, uh, you know, uh, gets established in French society. And not only that, France gets this all new concepts of liberty, freedom, equality, etc. But also it gives the world a new way towards this all concepts, whereby all other societies of the world also gets inspired, and till today they are being inspired from French Revolution, when these concepts of equality, concepts of liberty, freedom, etc. are concerned. So French Revolution becomes one of the eye opener of the world, whereby people were subjected to more liberal values, more liberal laws, keeping in mind the concept of equality, liberty, freedom, etc. So therefore we see that in world history we have seen a gradual transformation of the society, and with this transformation or with this evolution we see that the system changes with time, and therefore we see various revolutions taking place in the world. Now today we have discussed the American and the French Revolution, where we see that there is a continuous effort to acquire the rights of the common people and thereby ensure welfare to the people. So in the later sessions we will discuss the all other events which took place in the world history. So for today, uh, I would wrap up with this topic and hope you like the video. If you like the video, please share it as well as subscribe it. Thank you so much.